Welcome everyone, really good to have you here. My name is Martin Smedjeback and I really look forward to discussing strategies and on how we can make it better for animals in the world. And I do encourage us all to be looking at this neutrally, because it can be hard because we are often emotionally invested in our methods and maybe also organizational structures. I know I can be that way. We have our biases and we're influenced by that. And it could be a good thing because it could keep us faithful and hold on to good things. But I also believe that it could be a hinder and maybe make us not feel free to take on new methods if we find them more effective. So let me say a few things about me. I studied psychology at university, and then I spent 15 years in the peace movement working with nonviolence methods, nonviolence trainings, and also direct action towards or against weapons export. And now for the last 6 years I've been working full-time for animal rights in my crowdfunded project. Quite a lot of this time I spend on the Save movement, where I'm currently the chairperson. But let me say that during tonight, what I say and what I think, I do it mainly as an independent activist, and so I don't speak for the whole Save movement. And now I have the great pleasure to introduce Jamie Harris. Jamie has volunteered for a lot of animal advocacy organizations. Among them the Humane League, the Good Food Institute, and he also manages the local effective animal altruism group in London. And at Sentience Institute he works as a researcher, and he is also a researcher and a co-founder of a new non-profit called Animal Advocacy Careers. Many thanks for joining us, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks so much, Martin. Really glad to be here. Thanks for the invite, and glad to see lots of people here. Excited to think and talk about how to help animals effectively. That's always great.
So, Jamie, could you begin by telling us a little bit about Sentience Institute, because maybe not everyone is aware of this organization.
Yeah, certainly. So Sentience Institute, we are a social science think tank, basically, and we do research on various, into the kind of causal mechanisms behind social change in various ways. And our focus very much is on building the evidence base, understanding how to most effectively encourage an expansion of humanity's moral circle, i.e. the beings and entities that people consider and grant moral consideration to, such as including in society's laws and various things like that. And the focus to date has been almost exclusively on farmed animals, but we see this as part of a broader kind of mission to ensure that all beings who are worthy of moral consideration are granted moral consideration, basically. So yeah, as I say, it's kind of doing research to help understand how to encourage that mission most effectively, and obviously as with events like tonight and various other mechanisms, trying to share some of those conclusions with the wonderful people actually doing advocacy to encourage that kind of dream to be realized.
Thank you. And I noticed you mentioned effective and effectiveness several times. And I know some people might like recoil on this word and think, oh, you should do what is right, not what is effective, because that's cold and bureaucratic or something like that. What's your reaction to
that? Yeah, I do have a tendency to say the word effective a lot. I think most people share a desire to be effective in some way, right? If all else is equal, then we would probably all agree that helping 2 animals is better than helping 1. And really, that's all I'm getting at the core of it, is this idea of doing more where you can and where it's possible. Basically, it seems like a fairly non-controversial idea to me. I think there are ways in which it can be discussed, and where it can become associated with certain ideas that can feel cold and bureaucratic. But I kind of reject that notion that it is inherently cold and bureaucratic to have this emphasis on the consequences and the kind of bottom line of what you're doing. You know, every animal helped is an individual animal, and I am motivated to help those individuals as much as possible, whether that's by increasing the number of individuals helped or helping some individuals more than we otherwise would. All those things seem unambiguously good to me, and to some extent it seems almost cold to say that we shouldn't do those things. So I kind of appreciate that the ways in which it can be discussed can feel like that, but when it comes down to it, what we actually care about, I think we're probably either mostly aligned, or, as I say, I would kind of turn the table the other way around in some senses.
Right. So when I worked in the peace movement, we talked about theory of change. So the concept is that what kind of ideas you have around what creates change in society will like mold you in how you view the world and what happens to it. So I was thinking that I can give you my theory of change when it comes to animal rights, and it would be nice to have your reflection on it. So this is mine. It says, speciesism is so ingrained in our society that we need many more people to question the meat norm, speciesism, and instead be open to a future where animals are seen as individuals and not food. With this number, when we succeed in that, this number of people will grow, of course, and with that there will also be more and more animal rights activism, that with campaigns and actions, and this will lessen the meat norm and open up people for viewing animals in another way. And when politicians see that more and more people are having this change in view on animals, they feel more open to do political decisions and change institutions when it comes to animals. And also companies will change and see that there is a demand for vegan products from more and more people. And this step by step will create a society that eventually will be vegan, or at least mostly vegan, where finally it will be illegal to kill animals altogether. Yeah, what's your reflections on that?
Yeah, my general reflection is that when we're talking about things like theories of change, it's helpful to kind of break it down into its constituent parts and understand kind of what's the likelihood of certain things, certain changes resulting in the effects that we expect of them. What's the size of those effects, all those sorts of things. And with that kind of theory of change you just outlined to me, there's certainly a lot that I agree with, both on an intuitive level, and I think there's various types of evidence supporting various claims that you just made. I guess to just, for an example, to focus in on a specific part of it that you mentioned, I find it interesting you mentioned this idea of politicians kind of picking up on changes that are happening in society more widely and change attitudes and that sort of thing. To give an example of some evidence that's relevant to this, basically there's a bunch of social science research testing whether public opinion is an important determinant of the actions of legislators and actual new laws that are introduced and that sort of thing. It certainly does seem to be an important determinant. There are some essentially some kind of observational analyses that look at this sort of thing, some of which are summarized in a post that I wrote for my first project at Sentience Institute, actually, called How Tractable is Changing the Course of History. That said, although it's important, this idea of public opinion, I don't think it's essentially an area which could potentially be bypassed in some cases. There are plenty of examples from past social movements or ongoing social movements of where important changes have happened that have been driven or pushed through by politicians without necessarily there being majority public support for those changes. And a kind of key and fairly standout example of this is the increasing move to ban the death penalty in various parts of the world. Admittedly, not made too much headway in the United States, but in Europe, it is illegal in at least every member of the European Union. And this is something which is consistently been unpopular amongst voters. It's a change that has mostly happened at the kind of elite level. So just an example there of kind of where, if you kind of drill down the specific parts of a theory of change, you might be more or less confident about particular parts of it. And it's very hard to give a kind of like overall view on like, do I agree with Martin's theory of change? Yes, there's certainly many elements in there that I agree with, but I think it's for really kind of narrowing down and strategizing, I think it's helpful to break it down into those separate parts, if that makes sense.
Sure, and I think we will be touching on many of them when it comes to my coming questions. But let's go back to politicians. I feel that today animal rights is so radical in its view and what it wants that people, I mean politicians, okay, I agree that they might decide on certain things without having the whole majority with them. But I mean, they can't be too far away either, I think, because then either they don't agree themselves because it's such an extreme view, so it's not likely that they will be ending up in government or in parliament. But also, if they take this stance of doing this, they know that they won't be elected again, or?
Yeah, potentially. It depends what it is. There's a bunch of different ways in which those things may or may not play out. One example of a kind of a theoretical point, really, but is a distinction between issues that are more or less ethical. Actually, sorry, that's the wrong characterization. More or less kind of technical issues versus kind of simplistic morality issues that you can take a kind of principled stance on. With the kind of morality issues, there is probably more of an incentive for politicians to pay close attention to the wishes of their electorate, because in the more technical issues, the electorate probably won't understand, won't have a strong opinion, that sort of thing. So yeah, I agree that in general, that the politicians will never want to go too far if they think it's going to, if they think it's going to damage their chances of election. But there may be times where they're willing to take that kind of stance, or where public opinion just isn't going to play that much of a factor. Like if you think about the number of issues that occur in between an election cycle in a parliamentary democracy or whatever, then some specific changes, especially those kind of technical changes, are just going to get drowned out, and the politicians aren't kind of directly accountable for those decisions. So I think there are various mechanisms through which you might think that politicians aren't that strongly incentivized to pay too close attention to public opinion, and in which case they may be willing to push through things for other reasons, essentially. And of course, you might think that this varies from issue to issue for various reasons. You might think also that we're kind of, so far we're talking about kind of animal advocacy or animal rights or whatever you want to call it in a quite a general sense of making progress on those topics. But I think you can also kind of disaggregate it by individual policy changes that are being proposed. You might think, for example, the reaction to moving chickens from cages to barn-raised conditions, the reaction to that is going to be very different to some kind of outright ban on factory farming, or some outright ban on animal farming, or some, all these different policy proposals you could come up with. There's going to be different kind of specifics involved in those things.
That's actually something that leads me into my next question. And that is one of the big heated arguments within the animal rights movement. And that is if it's better to strive for animal welfare reforms or for animal rights. And the idea that I've heard is that, or the strategy behind it, is that welfare reform is a way to step by step makes the conditions for animals better, and in that way it leads to animal liberation in the end. And one example of this is the Open Wing Alliance, where they try to get rid of the cages for hens, and as you said, have them in barns instead. But the critique against this kind of approach is that animal welfare reforms could actually make it worse for animals. And the thinking behind that is that people will think, oh, but now they are getting better. The politician took these decisions, so now it's okay. I don't have to worry about animals anymore. What's your take on that?
Yeah, certainly an important question. And you're right that it's one that's commonly debated. And I like also that you link those issues, the kind of animal rights versus welfare debate, to that question about whether incremental changes tend to drive further progress and momentum for further change, or whether they cause this kind of complacency that sufficient change has already been achieved. I think that is essentially the main kind of strategic component of that debate about animal rights versus welfare, although potentially there are also some kind of disagreements regarding just broader ethical systems that might play into this as well, like consequentialism versus deontology and those sorts of things. But focusing on the kind of strategic issue, which is something I have kind of more expertise on, shall we say? I mean, I am certainly, it's a kind of theoretically compelling criticism of the incremental approach, of the kind of welfare focused approach, and it's something I have to say I worry about. I worry about it. It feels like if this was the case, that changes for animals, these kind of incremental steps for animals, were actually creating complacency, then I would not want to pursue those steps, because I am motivated to help animals the most on kind of longer time frames. I care not just about what happens to the animals in front of me or the animals kind of in the world currently, but overall, all things considered, what is best for animals and improving the world. So certainly if there was that complacency effect, then that would be a knockout argument against those incremental changes to me. So I do think it's super important. And I have that intuition that it's a risk. I guess the important thing to then say is, okay, we've got these intuitions, which are valid and an important part of our understanding and decision-making process, but we can also turn to various forms of evidence to better understand whether this is an effect that occurs in practice. And not just we can turn to these forms of evidence, I think we have an obligation to turn to those forms of evidence, because if we're making kind of these important strategic decisions based on gut feelings and just ignoring the available evidence, then we're essentially doing a disservice to animals by potentially making essentially the suboptimal decisions and strategic choices. So kind of after that fluff, what do I actually think about the topic, basically? I mentioned that I kind of find it a theoretically compelling concern, and there are some examples of where these sorts of where there do seem to have been some negative consequences arising from incremental tactics used in other movements. So to give an example, again, from the anti-death penalty movement, actually, there have been various Supreme Court rulings that have tended to be on things like the age at which people can be convicted given the death penalty, restrictions so that they can't be given to people with certain severe learning disabilities or mental health problems, that sort of thing. So there have been various kind of incremental changes towards restricting the death penalty. And there is some evidence, and I couldn't recite it off the top of my head, but there is some evidence, and it's contained in a footnote on my case study of the anti-death penalty movement, if you want to seek it out. But there is some evidence that actually those kinds of reforms have led to jurors, people on juries in America, being more willing to convict people and actually grant the death penalty, because essentially the argument is that they feel more kind of comfortable in the idea that the system is regulated, it must be safe, it must have kind of good checks and balances involved. That's the kind of the argument behind it. But there's some evidence that that's happened, and that's quite concerning. And there are a bunch of other examples as well of where there have been these kind of small changes that have potentially backfired in various ways. Another example that jumps to mind is there is an organization that created this kind of model code that, in theory, I mean, they were creating this legal code in order to challenge the death penalty, but it was actually used as a justification to reintroduce the death penalty in various states after there was some kind of restrictive federal legislation on the topic. There are these various concerns, and I do find those quite concerning. Kind of sporadic, anecdotal from these different case studies. It's true. One thing that does seem quite consistent on the kind of pushing in the other direction is that incremental changes happen and then more radical changes still happen afterwards. And so this doesn't necessarily prove that they do create momentum for further change, but it at least reassures me, and I think should reassure us in general, that if there is this kind of complacency effect from incremental change, then it's probably not very big, basically, that you can do the incremental change and then still achieve radical successes later. So to give an example, in the US anti-abortion movement, there have been various kind of restrictions on the availability of abortions at the state level, even at the federal level as well in some ways. And despite those changes, there have still been a number of much more radical bills passed in the last few years called heartbeat bills, which basically make abortion very difficult to achieve. They're far more radical, far closer to a kind of outright ban on abortion. And those have still been passed. Okay, so they face difficulties in the courts and various things like that. But in theory, it suggests that you can make incremental changes and then keep going, basically, keep doing the more radical things later. And there are a couple of different examples of this. The British anti-slavery movement has a number of examples of kind of small reforms to the industry that don't seem to have done anything to hinder the ability to actually abolish the slave trade and later emancipate slaves entirely. So that's a fairly consistent finding, and that reassures me that given the other benefits that probably arise from doing these sorts of campaigns, they may well be positive on balance in a long-term sense. I guess to kind of flesh out what I'm talking about when I'm talking about momentum, you can think about, for example, if you are in a country where there have never been animal advocacy campaigns, or not very many, or something like that, then you're faced with several options. You can either kind of go out there and say, we must be vegan, we must abolish animal farming right now, or something like that, in which case you might not get much traction. Or you can kind of find these intermediary steps and get volunteers involved, get people kind of talking about the issues. There'll be media publicity around it, all these sorts of things. So the momentum comes from both the kind of capacity building of people engaged in the advocacy movement itself, and also potentially attitude change and kind of public discussion around it. So there are opportunities in those senses. So I think there are kind of theoretically compelling reasons to think that also there are opportunities for momentum, basically. So I kind of talked about some of the social movement evidence. I just wanted to touch on that there are other types of evidence. And with these kind of big, important strategic questions, I think it's very important that we, as I say, we kind of draw on all the available evidence rather than just kind of picking our favorite bits of evidence that support our case. One example is there's actually been a kind of online experiment done by the group Mercy for Animals, and they did what this experiment did was it provided people with information about various kind of welfare changes, and then it asked them various questions to get a sense of their intention to change their diet afterwards. And they had a intervention group who were provided with this information about welfare changes, and then they had a control group who were provided with an irrelevant article. And there were statistically significant differences in favor of the intervention group. So what that means is basically people who read a short article about welfare changes reported a greater intention to go vegan, basically, or cut out animal products from their diet. I forget exactly how it was phrased, but I think that's a promising finding, and it supports that conclusion I was drawing from the social movement evidence. There are various other studies that we have that play into this somehow. There's some empirical evidence from the group for analytics as well that coverage after various welfare reforms, media coverage that is, and discussion on social media and that sort of thing, tends not to imply that the change is sufficient, and basically leaves scope for the idea that more change is desirable or at least possible. Mm-hmm. So there's all these different types of evidence that, for me, stack up to be, it's certainly not a kind of knockdown case, but my current view is that there is probably a non-negligible effect that on balance, welfare reforms and other kinds of incremental change help to build momentum for further change, and that therefore overall they will be positive on the kind of long run, on animals' interests in the long run. But it's something I continue to worry about, and think as ever, as a researcher does, more research is needed. I have many ideas of experiments that could be run that would help us to kind of narrow down our confidence on this. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
In my intuition says that it's perhaps about the language you use also, and but I don't think animal rights, but maybe animal welfare, because of course there are those animal welfare organizations that still think it's okay to eat meat, but if you have a message saying it's totally fine if we eat free range chickens or whatever, then it might backfire and say, it won't have this progress as we hope it will, right?
Yeah, that definitely seems intuitively plausible to me. Again, going back to the British anti-slavery movement, those kind of small reforms to the industry that focused on the welfare of slaves were kind of, when advocates pushed for them, they were framed as changes, steps towards the wider goal of abolishing slavery, basically. Right. And this isn't strong kind of causal evidence that they had positive effects in that sense, but to the extent that the movement was successful in the long run, we can treat that as weak evidence that is a positive thing to do. I also do share the intuition that framing, in many senses, in many contexts, makes a massive difference. I think as you say, there are some welfare organizations that their end goals are more or less radical. For instance, the Humane League, who, as you mentioned, I have volunteered with previously, their framing is very much, at least if you go on their website, their framing is very much about ending animal farming. I guess I still worry sometimes that some of the way that victories are touted could be counterproductive, like when pictures are shown of like happy chickens when it's like, no, that's not what you've achieved yet. Like, that seems potentially counterproductive. But it's hard to evaluate those kind of specific things, basically, without doing lots of different studies that we just don't have the time and funding for currently.
And one other big strategic question is whether to focus on individual change or institutional change. And my impression is that the animal rights movement in Sweden, and I guess in the world, has focused more on the individual, like the message "Go Vegan" or something like that. So what does the science say about this strategic question?
Yeah. So I kind of like to start with, there's this quite helpful post by animal charity evaluators, where they have kind of totted up some of the spending of different animal advocacy nonprofits on different types of interventions, and they've categorized it in a way that doesn't exactly match up to that kind of institutional individual distinction that you made, and that we at Sentience Institute have been making for a long time, but I think it's helpful. They found that essentially, actually, having started talking about this, I can't remember the exact numbers, but they found that the proportion of resources spent on what they called public opinion, and they're including in that dietary change and also just kind of amorphous discussion of public opinion, that sort of thing, was substantially more than spending on institutional tactics or tactics focused on animal product alternatives. If I recall correctly, it was something in the region of kind of double the spending, but yeah, don't quote me on that. So yeah, certainly that backs up your intuition that the animal advocacy movement has tended to focus on these individual asks. So the question of whether that's a good thing or not, well, at Sentience Institute, we've kind of long been arguing that the farmed animal movement has focused too much on these individual asks relative to these institutional tactics and institutional asks. And so where's this coming from? Well, it's coming from a number of different angles, really. I'll start with what is one of the most striking, which is that this is kind of just an intuitive comparison. But if you think of the number of people, or the proportion of people, more helpfully, who in the US or European countries, kind of global north, developed Western countries, that sort of thing, who are vegetarian or vegan, obviously varies country to country, but the numbers are small. In the US, it seems it's almost certainly less than 5% of people. A few years ago, and we've done some updates since then, but we conducted a survey where we asked a number of different questions about support for a number of different institutional asks, basically. And these included things like, do you support a ban on animal farming, a ban on factory farming, a ban on slaughterhouses? Like these big changes that if they went through would either make everyone vegan because the system would be unsustainable or come very close, right? And the number of people who supported those changes was massive. It was nearly 50% in each of those three examples I gave. And there are some questions where the support is much higher for slightly less radical asks. And so you might think, well, how do these things match up? Well, somewhere in there's this big distinction between the change that people are willing to make as individuals, that they're willing to say, yes, I will change my diet, every day when I go out and buy food, or when I sit down and eat a meal 3 times a day. We can say, I often see vegans saying it's easy to go vegan, and like, yes, I found it easy to go vegan, but for whatever reason, whatever combination of reasons, people don't do this on a large scale, or at least they currently haven't. And yet they're willing, the same people who every day sit down, eat animal products, whatever, are often willing to say that they would support society more widely moving towards these changes, which would have the same effect, basically. And so there's clearly somewhere in between there's this big distinction between those individual changes and the institutional changes. And the institutional changes just seem a lot easier to kind of get support for, if not to kind of secure.
But Jamie, may I comment on that? Yeah, I've seen those studies too, and it does seem strange that about 50% wants to ban slaughterhouses. But it seems so unlikely that will happen. I mean, do you have any evidence on even though some people say it, or many people say it, that any of these institutional changes really have gone through in a way?
Have they already been passed? No, I don't have evidence of that. I guess, there are various ways in which this isn't the end answer, right? It's not like as soon as we get above 50% on a survey question, the law is passed automatically. That's not how it works. That said, a kind of intuitive argument here. It's much easier. There's much less of a difference between saying, yes, I support this change on a survey question, compared to saying, yes, I support this change on a referendum or ballot initiative asking for the same sort of change, than it is to say on a survey question, yes, I want to go vegan, compared to day in, day out, changing your diet. So yeah, we can have a debate about like, oh, if you change the wording, would it reduce the number from 50% down to X%, right? There are all those sorts of considerations to play in. But I think after all the caveats, after all the discussion is done, there's still a big difference here that needs explaining, basically. So that's, I kind of wanted to lead with that finding, because it just seems so striking, basically, and counterintuitive. I think if you'd asked me, I didn't do this before I actually read the results, but I know certainly my colleagues at Sentience Institute did. If you'd asked me in advance how many people will say this, how many people would say they would support a ban on factory farming, which would be kind of the best way to test if you have, if these kind of criticisms you have actually stack up. I would have given a much lower number, like 10% or something. So there's definitely a surprising thing here that needs explaining. I kind of don't want to suggest that that's all the evidence we have. There's like a bunch of different evidence that points in this direction, basically. Some of the social movement evidence I've been talking about also seems to suggest that this kind of institutional focus would probably be key. There is, I'm kind of spending some time at the moment really looking through the case studies we've done so far. The intuitive claim is that like there aren't many social movements that have been successful that have had a dietary focus or had an individual change focus or focused exclusively on that. Perhaps the best example that seems to have been quite successful despite having a substantial focus on that is the environmentalism movement with recycling. But then even then it hasn't been the sole focus, and it's arguable whether that's actually achieved very much or been a distraction. I think a claim that there's actually stronger evidence for from the case studies we've done so far is that there are very few social movements the kind of extent to which a social movement focuses on legislative tactics, actually changing the law, is correlated with the extent of their success, basically. That's not a causal relationship. We don't have evidence that the more you focus on this, you definitely will achieve more. But that's pretty striking to me, that it seems that successful social movements focus a lot on legislation. So yeah.
Right. So let's be more practical then, because we in the same movement in Sweden, we have been thinking about using more, going for more institutional change. But I mean, it's one thing to go to a store and try to change them and try to get rid of the cage eggs, because they can do that without a very big cost, I imagine, and you have something to negotiate on. But in the same moment, we want to ban the slaughterhouses. We don't want less slaughter or kinder slaughter. I don't know if that, I mean, if that's really possible, but yeah, what would that look like, a campaign on slaughterhouses? Yeah, for the same movement or other movements. Do you have any ideas on that?
It's not something I thought a lot about, the real practicalities of that particular ask. I guess, I mean, in theory, you could. So one interpretation of that would be that just like focusing on slaughterhouses seems especially tractable, especially promising. You might then think, we still want some kind of incremental steps in between, in which case, yeah, that's going to be harder. You might think about things like CCTV in slaughterhouses. You might think about ways of just kind of restricting what they currently do, making it harder for them to operate in various ways. Alternatively, depending on your view in this kind of like the promise of more or less radical asks, you might just say, we're going to ask for the banning of slaughterhouses and see where that takes us. I am probably more optimistic about campaigns trying that than various people I've spoken to who do kind of similar research to myself. As I say, haven't thought a lot about it, so this is just a kind of an intuitive reaction. But I think you might get a lot of traction for people just kind of agreeing that like what goes on in slaughterhouses is bad, is a terrible thing, and without necessarily thinking in too much detail about the exact consequences of what that would entail, might be willing to sign a petition or even join you handing out leaflets outside a slaughterhouse or whatever it is, in support of that goal.
But would you then also go to politicians and try to do it, the political way to ban? I mean, that's the only way I see it to ban, and it has to be some kind of political decision or laws.
Yeah, I think in the case of an outright ban, there is not much, you can't really kind of convince the slaughterhouses to ban themselves. So I think it's necessarily going to be a legislative intervention. And yes, asking politicians, or, depending on the country's laws, I don't actually know if Sweden has this sort of thing available, but, there might be possibilities for ballot initiatives and referendums where you have a popular vote on the topic, basically. But that's a whole different game, basically. But yeah, no, that would be presumably the goal. That'd be what you'd be building towards, is persuading politicians to actually pass a ban in that sense.
One thing that we actually tried was to also get to the ones working with the slaughterhouse, like the transport firms, maybe if they have ads to like a hockey team or something like that, if you can push those. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a nice idea. And my gut reaction is that seems like a good way to make some kind of concrete progress towards the goal. I can think of a couple of kind of comparable examples. Like, for example, in the death penalty movement, I know I keep using that example. I have done other case studies, but in the death penalty movement, there's been there was some activism to kind of cut off supply of lethal injection drugs, which were really successful. And it's kind of, actually in that particular case, it's unclear whether this was actually beneficial overall once you kind of consider the indirect effects. But certainly, like, it seems plausible that there would be ways to build momentum for a ban on slaughterhouses by basically cutting off the support, or even if it didn't ban them, it could just make it a lot more difficult to operate slaughterhouses and kind of make progress on the problem in that way.
Right. All right. Thank you. And let's move on to another method. The method that is also kind of controversial within the animal rights movement, and that is civil disobedience. Another confrontational methods. And the argument for could be that we need that to push the society, because the society and people in general are so unwilling to even talk about this issue, that we need to spark an interest or force really them to the negotiation table, if you will. The opponents of this method would probably say that there is a risk for a backfire effect, that people will get a more negative reaction because they see it as extreme or or not relatable in some way if we use these methods. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a few. I'll sort of start with a caveat that compared to the previous two issues, this is something I've personally thought a bit less about. That said, we have thought about it a decent amount at Sentience Institute as an organization. With several of these topics, and I don't know if you were drawing on, I think you were drawing on this to phrase the questions, Martin, which is great. But for people listening, we have this page on our website called the Foundational Questions in, actually, what do we exactly call it? Summaries of foundational questions in effective animal advocacy. And essentially this kind of lists out these various kind of big kind of strategic questions and lists arguments for and against. So most of the stuff I'm talking about is listed on those on that page. So if people want to dive into those later, this page in this instance might give a better showing of the case for and against than I'm going to currently. But yes, I guess I don't have a particularly strong view on like civil disobedience specifically, and I do see it as part of this kind of wider debate on the pros and cons of kind of confrontational activism. You laid out some of the key pros and cons. I think there are various social movements that have used confrontational activism with seeming success, and probably example that, at least for me, is most salient, and I'm sure for many other people here will jump to mind, is the African-American civil rights movement in the US in the kind of 60s and 70s, and the various civil disobedience that occurred there. There are various other movements that have kind of used similar tactics, women's rights movements, for example. And I quite often see these movements being the movements that activists use in support of this claim that confrontational tactics, peaceful confrontational tactics, can be effective. I have a concern that using these social movements as evidence is kind of drawing lessons from the wrong movements. So at Sentience Institute, the case studies that we do focus on what we call ally-based movements, and essentially movements that are driven not by the intended beneficiaries of the movement itself, but by essentially allies, by supporters. In our case, right, we're talking about farmed animals. Farmed animals, they might be able to resist farmers in various ways and like kick and bite and things like that, but they can't organize this kind of systematic opposition. So they rely on us, right? They rely on human allies to advocate for them. There are other movements like this. These are the ones we tend to study, like the anti-abortion movement. That's why we focus on that. The anti-death penalty movement. People on death row don't have a huge amount of kind of advocacy capability. So we've focused on movements where we think that they are mostly driven by allies rather than the intended beneficiaries themselves. And I think in this case of confrontation versus non-confrontation, it's an area where the evidence from movements that aren't ally-based is especially weak, basically. You can think of a bunch of ways in which it might be more promising for the direct victim of oppression to engage in this kind of confrontational tactic. You might think that it generates more sympathy, for example, if you actually see somebody who has been oppressed, who has been violently oppressed, kind of resolutely standing against that violence and not giving into violence themselves or whatever. You can see how that's kind of a lot more emotionally compelling than just some kind of like do-gooder, essentially, like us kind of standing on the side and doing that kind of confrontational activism. Another way in which it might be more promising for non-ally based movements is just that they have kind of larger pools of willpower potentially. If you're trying to ask somebody to get involved with a movement, if they are the victim, they might be more willing to kind of sit through some, arrest or being heckled by bystanders or whatever it is, than somebody who doesn't have anything personally to gain, who is just doing this out of sheer altruism. And so in various ways, I think these kind of confrontational tactics seem more promising for movements that are not ally based. So that's all a bit of a might feel like a bit of a moan, because I think whilst it's important to kind of understand the strength of various evidence, we also, weak evidence is still valid. So I still think that gives us some indication that confrontational tactics can be helpful. And it's only really the case against it still has to rest on basically, is there contrary evidence? Is there evidence to suggest that confrontational tactics are bad or are less effective than alternatives? And yes, I think we do sometimes have examples of the kind of backfire effect that you mentioned. An example from the anti-abortion movement, there have been, they're not great studies, but there have been some studies of what's called sidewalk counseling, which is basically where people stand outside abortion clinics and try and somewhat aggressively persuade people not to go in. They kind of just them about and heckle them and tell them that it's like a terrible idea, all this sort of thing. And there's some kind of surveys and studies to suggest that this actually just makes people angry and upset and almost more determined to go ahead with the abortion decision. And it doesn't really seem to turn anyone away. In contrast to some studies, there was also not using, this isn't a perfect experiment comparing the two methods, but there have been studies suggesting that a much kind of softer approach using what do they call them? Crisis pregnancy centers, which are basically, rather than go to an abortion clinic, come here and we'll talk you through the problems type thing, has had some success in convincing people not to have abortions. So we can find examples like that where it seems like non-confrontational tactics may be more promising at that kind of individual change. There's that kind of backfire effect from the confrontational tactics.
For me, it simplifies a bit too much if we take all the confrontational methods into one category. One distinction I feel in my gut is very important is if it's non-violent or not. So Barbara Deming, American activist, she talked about two hands of non-violence, and one that says, stop, I will resist, I will do direct action, I will put myself like in front of whatever is oppressing. But it's also this hand, like I will talk to you, I will sit down and have a coffee with you, I'm going to respect you, and so on. And it's not about shouting like you mentioned at the abortion clinic, demeaning or threatening things, because you are non-violent. Also, you try to be, at least in your communication, in language. For me, that's a big change, and something maybe that can offset this backfire effect, possibly. But even if some people do react negatively, the thinking is also that that's okay if enough people get turned the other way towards us, and maybe also become active, and some confrontation methods could do just that. It will turn away some, but make more into activists and supporters.
Yeah. A bunch of thoughts on that. Just with that last point you made, I agree that something that is polarizing could still be beneficial in total. And the question then becomes, what's the net effect? What's the overall effect? Do more people join, or do people tend to become more or less persuaded, basically? Or if you're thinking that the benefit is just mobilization, it could even be that overall public opinion worsens, but you get some really key activists or something like that. Like, I can see various ways in which you could have a backfire effect, but it's still being worthwhile. That is true. Jumping back to the thing you said at the start, which is just the kind of the general argument that it's simplifying somewhat to kind of divide things into confrontational and non-confrontational and stack up arguments for and against that kind of binary. Yes. At Sentience Institute, on this kind of foundational question summaries page and approach we take generally, we have kind of phrased things as a bit of a binary. I think it's helpful to be able to bring some clarity to the discussion, right, and work out what evidence is relevant here. I guess one caveat is that it's a spectrum, not a binary. A lot of the time, you could have more or less confrontational activism versus complete, as opposed to non-confrontational versus confrontational. And also, I agree entirely that it's going to depend on the specific circumstances. It's going to depend on things like who your audience is, what the specific thing you're asking for is, and some kind of contextual factors. So some examples of that, I have an intuition that lawmakers are more, if we're kind of targeting lawmakers, they're more likely to be alienated than, say, I don't know, the general public, who might be inclined to think, this is worthwhile. This is kind of worth the cost. But, unclear. Again, anti-abortion movement, there was some kind of fairly heavy restrictions after various types of confrontational activism. So, even though public opinion on the abortion topic didn't really change that much at that time, so you might think it's especially alienating towards people in kind of positions of responsibility, lawmakers, that sort of thing. Another way in which it might differ is again, this is kind of an intuition. I don't have much evidence to support this, but if there's a lot of popular support for an issue, then confrontational tactics might be more promising. So you could, confrontational tactics seem pretty likely to kind of increase the salience of a topic, right? Increase public debate on it. Another topic for another discussion, I guess, but I'm much less convinced that increasing the salience of issues is always helpful. But if there's a lot of public support for it, then really maybe all you're trying to do is force the issue, basically draw attention to it, get politicians to go, okay, we can't ignore this anymore. So for instance, caged eggs, getting rid of cages seems to be a thing that a lot of the public are very, very strongly against, right? People say, if you ask them, they don't want caged eggs to exist, even though they might go out and buy them themselves. So if you do some confrontational protests and really just force politicians to pay attention to this topic, and they're getting demonstrations outside Parliament every day where it's a big song and dance, and it's impossible for them to ignore, and there's news crews and all that sort of thing, then confrontational tactics might be especially promising in that context, where there's kind of public support. And I always like drawing on the example of VGT in Austria, who have this kind of approach of where they kind of try and increase public opinion and then bring in the confrontational tactics. I think that's really interesting. I don't have strong evidence that it's especially promising, but it intuitively seems great. As for the kind of the violence versus non-violence, again, not apart from just the kind of initial moral repulsion against violence in a general sense, I don't have a kind of a strong kind of strategic opinion on it. For me, it's kind of similar to the confrontational versus non-confrontational debate, except the cons seem much more extreme. Like if you think there's negative reputational effects of confrontational activism, it seems pretty likely that they'll be especially negative if your activism is violent, for example. And there is some evidence kind of specifically on this topic, which again, I haven't looked into very much, but I know it exists. The kind of, as far as I'm aware, one of the most famous examples is this book, Why Civil Resistance Works, by Erica Chenoweth and Mariah Stephan, which looked at, I was talking about that kind of ally-based versus non-ally-based distinction earlier. So admittedly, the studies are all non-ally-based movements. It's kind of territorial movements, but they did find this kind of quite striking correlation between success and use of non-violent tactics, being basically much higher success rates for non-violent movements. So there's some evidence in favor of non-violence there as well.
In a few minutes we will invite others, but I want to go back and touch a bit on this with ally-based movements. I think it's an interesting point, as you said, one can pick the movements that you like, and maybe that correlates with your intuition and what kind of methods you like. And maybe not surprisingly, I've chosen the civil rights movement. That's where I've studied the most. And you're right that, of course, it was primarily black people who joined that movement. And I think you're right also that it's easier to get more people in the movement if it matters directly to yourself. But we shouldn't forget that there were some white people in that movement as well, and they were also hit down with the clubs from the police and the hoses of the police and so on. And I'm not sure. I mean, that effect could be possibly even stronger, because here is someone fighting for someone else. Maybe you get more empathy because that person don't have to be there. They don't struggle for their own sake or their own families. Couldn't that be the case for animal rights instead, that the empathy will get more if we get punished or some way disadvantaged?
Yeah, certainly could be the case. the British anti-slavery movement had a few notable examples of where sympathy seems to have been massively increased for the kind of anti-slavery cause after there was seemingly unjustified violence against white missionaries who were kind of just scapegoated for some slave revolts, for example. So I can certainly see the case, that could be the case. I guess I was more just making the point that this introduces some potentially quite important differences that just mean that the evidence derived from those social movements seems less applicable to our movement. So it's not necessarily that it's not necessarily a clear point that it's not going to work. I can just kind of see some reasons why. It basically just means I place less weight on that evidence than I otherwise would if that thing was similar. But as I say, I don't think it kind of makes it completely invalid as evidence. It just means it's slightly, I place less weight on it than I otherwise would, basically.
So I saw Leo first. Please go ahead.
So I was with May, and we were talking a little bit about like how our introduction to animal rights, or at least like the thinking of animal rights, happened, and May come to the conclusion that if I'm obligated to speak in your part, May, she said that having these small changes makes people more aware of the problem itself. So it will be more in the media. It will be more talking about it, and so on. You will think about it more, and therefore you will probably go vegan, or at least think more about animal ethics and animal rights. While I may not be in the same, I may not agree. I think that we should aim for animal liberation or abolition straight away. So I think that's the least we can do. But I understand what she means, and I think it could be like all ways are good ways, maybe. I'm not sure. But please, May, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I mean, I think your point has to do with the dignity of animals, and how not respecting their dignity it is to go bit by bit. But I mean, I was equating it to the civil rights movement versus the slavery situation now. And I guess the question is, we have to decide whether they're in slavery, because if they're in slavery, then we must completely abolish the situation. If they're not in slavery and we're working for incremental civil rights, then we have to accept the same kind of situation that African Americans have accepted for the last 200 years, which is incremental change. But I mean, I do probably think that they are in slavery, but I just don't think that we will succeed if we tried to abolish slavery for them. I'm certain we wouldn't succeed, because what is it? 5% of people are even vegetarians. They're not going to listen. I can't even get half of my friends to talk to me about this. They don't even want to talk. So it won't work.
I think, in my opinion, I can see the veganism movement as evolution. I think eventually people are going to get more involved. And it is just as simple as that. We want to do the right, and as we have been doing for people, as the example you put about the African Americans here and slavery in the US, I think it's gonna happen eventually the same with animals, probably.
Thank you. On my list is Gustav and Marlin, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for an interesting discussion. The first question that we have actually is about Corona, and because a lot of the effective activism that we've seen maybe could be based on these mass movements, but currently it's a very limiting environment for mass movements. We have activists, like smaller things, like 8 people active. So the question is, Jamie, what are your thoughts on effective activism now? Would you go towards planning activism in the future, or do you think there are things we can still do in this Corona time?
Yeah, not something I thought a great deal about, but I do think there are things that can still be done. Obviously it depends what asks you're moving towards, but I think there's plenty of opportunity for kind of online activism that can have some effect. It's not the ideal thing in some campaigns, right? But for instance, if with the example used before of pressuring companies to make changes, then they can be quite persuaded by just like lots of their customers telling them that they're appalled by their behavior and stuff like that. And that can be done online, and all the protests do is add some kind of visibility to it, basically. So I do think there will be opportunities. It depends, as I say, it depends kind of exactly what you're trying to achieve and who you're trying to target. But yeah, I think obviously the situation is forcing people to come up with creative new ways to do their advocacy, and that's one of them. The other thing that you could, I guess, just think about is kind of shifting the focus, because you want to keep there being opportunities for people to stay engaged and stay motivated, right? So you might want to think about just kind of alternative ways to keep the same community of people going, even if they don't have the same focus that they can focus on at that time. That's another option. But yeah, if essentially your whole model is based on face-to-face demonstrations or something, then it's going to necessarily probably be a combination of looking at alternatives, keeping the community going, and planning for the future. But yeah.
Great, thank you. Malin, yeah, you.
Thank you for today, and thanks for answering our questions. I have another question. Let's say that 1 year ago, we didn't even have this COVID problem in Sweden. So it's so crazy that we're having even more challenges now as activists. Maybe it's good. Maybe we become more creative out of it. I don't know. So let's say we don't have Corona. We can go out and be 100 people if we can and do demonstrations. What are your like top 3 things that I, as a part-time activist, or I'm an activist on my free time, like weekends and evenings, what are your recommendations of what I should do in order to be as efficient as possible? Is it demonstration? Is it videos? Is it writing debate articles? Is it standing outside the parliament, giving out leaflets to politicians, or all of them, but like a little bit here and there? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for both those questions. But so I guess most of what we've been talking about today has been this kind of top-down kind of movement strategy type question, right? And so I do think that that's a key part of what you're asking. Essentially, like, as an individual, what should I focus on at any one point? An important part of that is which actions should the movement be focusing on? Which actions should the movement be focusing on? Which will be most effective encouraging change for animals? So I think that's one important consideration. And so to that extent, you know, it's a combination of these various considerations we've been talking about, like, should I do institutional or individual change? Should I do confrontational or non-confrontational activism? And kind of what does that lead you to? If you're asking me like which particular tactic am I most optimistic about, I don't have a particularly strong view, because I've spent most of my time thinking about these kind of broader heuristic questions. No, I'm not going to just pluck a random thing out and make a top suggestion, because I would regret it later. I was tempted, but I'm going to resist the temptation. I think I'll also say that in addition to those kind of impact potential considerations, there are a bunch of factors that come in when you think about what you as an individual can best achieve. And this is something that I've thought a lot more in the context of the other nonprofit I work at, Animal Advocacy Careers. And we have this page on our website. Actually, I might as well just share these 2 links in the chat, seeing as I'm kind of drawing on these. But I'll share first of all that foundational question summary page I mentioned. And now I'll share also the one from Animal Advocacy Careers, which is our glossary of terms page. And on it this is mostly for thinking about careers you could take, but I think the same sorts of considerations might apply to a lot of kind of individual activism decisions. So I'll give an example. The most kind of obvious one that jumps to mind is this idea of personal fit. Like, how good are you at doing a certain thing, right? And so let's take the example you mentioned of, should you write articles on a topic, or should you go out and hit the streets and start demonstrating. So one thing there is like, you might have a sense of whether demonstrations in general are effective or not, and whether article writing is in general effective or not. But you might also think that like, even if you thought one was more effective than the other, you might still do what you thought was the less effective one if you thought you were especially good at it. So for example, let's imagine you think the movement needs to invest way more in demonstrations. If you think that, you might still think, I as an individual am best placed to write articles because I'm great at it. Like maybe you're a journalist or something, or you've got some contacts, or you're especially good at writing or whatever. There might be various reasons why you should focus on it anyway. And so, yeah, I just kind of wanted to emphasize that there's a bunch of other factors that come in when you're thinking about what you as an individual should do. Yeah, and I guess just to kind of put the kind of categories of actions out there, there's obviously volunteering and activism in the sense that you mentioned, of like demonstrations, that sort of thing. There's also one that is sometimes kind of sort of shunned in animal advocacy, is donating, right? Non-profits need money to operate. Even activism-led non-profits usually have paid staff that run things behind the scenes, or do the operations or the administration or the strategizing, any of those things, and they need money to operate. And the movement is very funding constrained. The movement kind of repeatedly reports a lack of money being one of the biggest problems they face. So donating what you can spare can be a really important way of helping animals. And then there's also, I've said kind of donating, I've said volunteering or activism. And you can also think about how to use your career, basically, because again, something that people don't necessarily think about, there are plenty of ways that you can use your career that help animals on a day-to-day basis, basically. Some examples, like obviously one could be working for a nonprofit. One could just be like earning as much money as you can, so you can donate as much of it as you can. One could be working in policy and politics and trying to kind of have an inside influence in that sort of thing, or even just somewhere in the bureaucracy, having some kind of position of influence within that could be great. And then there's also obviously things like working in food companies and having some influence within that system, whether that's directly creating animal product alternatives or just working in companies that could potentially move towards that. You could work in academia, you could work in research, you could also work in other kinds of advocacy roles. Like I mentioned, journalists, like they obviously have a lot of opportunity for kind of public facing discussion and that sort of thing. So yeah, just to kind of emphasize the point that there are ways you can have a massive impact through your career essentially as well. So yeah, kind of separately from the movement-wide strategy, we've also got those kind of individual considerations. And yeah, career, volunteering and donations are the main ones that jump to mind, the kind of categories of actions we can take. And then within each of those, you want to be thinking about those things like personal fit and all the other considerations on that page. But yeah, thanks for a great question.
Then I had Samuel. Do you still have to have a comment?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, my one question is, we just recently saw that the Animal Rights Alliance in Sweden, they did, well, it's not a legal type of activism. They placed cameras inside a slaughterhouse, and the end result was that the footage from the slaughterhouse ended up with them closing down the slaughterhouse because it showed like people kicking animals and treating them really bad, even though if it was after they were stunned, basically. People were so appalled by this, it caused a massive outrage. So my question is basically what you think of these types of activisms where you break the law but you end up like as an organization or as an individual making bigger changes. It hasn't really created the big spark that I hoped it would, like in terms of like, okay, should we have video CCT of all slaughterhouses? But it might in turn do so if we push it enough. That was my question. Was it clear?
Yeah, I think you were just asking for reflections on that, on those tactic types. Yeah, I am optimistic about the importance and usefulness of undercover investigations in general. I think they're very hard to evaluate what the actual effects are. You can't easily measure what the effects are because they're very indirect in a lot of ways. I think the example you raise is an interesting one, because I think one great opportunity presented by those undercover investigation videos is that they are used as steps towards particular institutional campaigns. So we're talking about that individual versus institutional debate earlier. I think if you can do an undercover investigation that feeds into a welfare campaign or the example you just gave, then it's another way to kind of harness lots of kind of secure some impact for animals out of them, in addition to various indirect effects of basically people just knowing and talking more about the issues underlying them. I think they're great reference points for discussion. Like sometimes when I talk to people about the topic in general and why I find it important, I basically say things along the lines of, I'm sure you've seen undercover investigation footage, and the answer is almost always yes. Like, it's great that we have that stuff out there. It's, as I say, hard to evaluate, but I'm generally optimistic. In terms of I think kind of attached was a question about whether like breaking the law can be justified. Apart from the kind of moral issue, like, do you think the law can ever be broken? I'll leave that to one side. I think it's kind of just going to depend on what you think, what your best guess of the consequences are. Do they work out on average, all things considered, positive or negative for the movement, not just the animals? Because I think sometimes with that question, it's tempting to say anything's worth it if it helps animals, because this problem is so pressing. But you got to think about the effects on the movement's reputation, its ability to continue to do activism, all those sorts of things. But those things being said, I think that things that are technically illegal could plausibly sometimes be widely supported, because it's hard to condemn something that just reveals bad conditions. But ag-gag laws in America show that they can be condemned. So yeah, it's a tough one.
Thank you. And then I have Love, please.
Hey, I found the unmute button. Thank you so much for an interesting conversation. It was really interesting that about ally or not ally-based I forgot the words. Yeah.
Movements.
Yeah. Thank you. Movements. Oh, wasn't that hard? Yeah, but I had a question, but I forgot it. Or I think it was answered. Yeah,
cool.
It was about the most effective way to advocate for animals, but.
Yeah. No, I'll kind of repeat what I said. It's very tempting to kind of pick to pick something and give a quick response, but I'll resist the temptation, because I think it depends on some of those contextual factors about individuals and what's best for you, what's best in the context, all those sorts of things. That said, these foundational questions I've been discovering, I think they are very helpful for kind of pointing at particular areas and saying, there are promising tactics in this general space. And so within that, you can just kind of think, yeah, okay, so like, I mean, for instance, I've been making the case that I think institutional tactics are promising. I am less convinced that some people that there are particular types of tactics that stand out as being especially promising. So I've actually written a blog post called forgetting the exact title, but it's something along the lines of which institutional tactics can we use? And it's basically just a big long list of things that could potentially be really promising for animals. So I'm kind of in that frame of mind that it's not clear which specific tactic is necessarily best. And I think it's about trying things out, working out which works best in which context and what you can best do as an individual or an organization. But yeah, obviously super important question to be thinking about. What is most effective can we be doing? It's just that I don't think there's a blanket answer. So yeah, good question from both you and the previous asker. But and yeah, thanks for asking that question.
Thank you all. And I think we will be wrapping up slowly here. We're almost at the end of our time together. But I want to mention that you are active, Jamie, in animal advocacy careers. So if you want to find a career that is good for animals, you can turn to your organization, right? And you have a website you can begin to look at, right? And maybe contact you, or how does that work? If you want more help, then you can find on the website.
Yeah, so the best thing would be, we've kind of accumulated some various types of online advice. So definitely the best thing to do would be have a bit of a poke around. We're sort of currently trying something that's a bit more working with organizations. So we're not doing kind of like one-to-one advising or anything at the moment, but we're quite likely to offer something later in the year, either one-to-one advising or another round of our online course that we have that kind of talks you through these steps. So I'd basically, for the moment, have a look around the website, probably sign up to our newsletter, and look out for opportunities that we offer later in the year.
And I might mention also something similar, but more wide in the effective altruism movement. There is something called 80,000 hours that also gives you advice on how you can help out most in the world when it comes to your particular interests and qualities. I can comment also on these fundamental questions that you at Sentience Institute have. I've read them and I found them very interesting. I have to admit I found it a bit annoying that it wasn't more clear, that I want to say, oh, this is better or that is better. you listed pros and cons, which is helpful, but sometimes you want clear answers, but often there aren't, of course, any really clear answers.
Yeah, just a quick note on that. I appreciate that. Basically, when we come to stronger conclusions, we make a post about it and try and encourage people. So you'll notice on our blog, we do have a lot of content about this institutional versus individual question, because it's something that we have a particularly strong view on. The others, we're kind of, in the process of coming to stronger views on them. So rather than prematurely argue one way or another, we've taken this kind of listing the arguments for and against. But I appreciate that as advocates, you want the answers as soon as possible, basically. So I guess encourage people to fund the Sentience Institute, and we'll try and get there quicker.
And I can really encourage you to visit their website to look, because I find that so valuable that some of you, like you, are doing research. And there is also animal charity evaluators. Maybe you mentioned them. They do a lot of work. And you have mentioned some of the bigger US organizations like the Humane League. I mean, they do some research on their own, don't they, about methods and how they work and so on. Because, I mean, we small organizations like the Save Movement in Sweden, I mean, we don't really have the resources, I find, or I find we can't prioritize doing the research. We have to be on the streets doing the actions. But I'm really grateful that we together can find out the best ways and to help each other out with this. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here tonight and spending time on thinking about these important, I think really important ideas. It is for the animals we do this, and for a future where they are not being exploited and killed anymore. So I appreciate that we take some time to think about this, and especially thank you, Jamie Harris, for doing this with us.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Martin. And just wanted to echo that really appreciate you guys coming and listening to this and thinking about these important questions and doing work to help animals generally. It's super important. So thanks all.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone.